This was the kind of story that felt real because almost everyone had seen some version of it before. A room full of confident people had underestimated the quietest person in it, and by the time they understood what they were looking at, the cost of that mistake had almost become fatal. The first thing anyone truly noticed was not the siren outside the hospital or the overhead speaker cracking through clipped emergency codes. It was the abrupt death of laughter in someone's throat. 1 second, the trauma bay at Tidewater Memorial was noisy in the ordinary way, with metal wheels rattling over tile, rubber soles squeaking, monitors chirping, and voices overlapping in practiced urgency. The next second, the entire room had tightened into something sharp and charged, because the nurse they had spent the whole shift quietly mocking had suddenly become the only person in the room who sounded as if she knew exactly how to keep 3 dying patients alive at once. Lena Vale did not shout. She never needed to. Her voice had a cutting kind of precision that moved faster than volume. She directed attention to the second bay, called for warmed fluids, identified the need for respiratory isolation in another patient, and demanded that a second ultrasound machine be brought in immediately. She spoke as if panic were beneath the dignity of the work, and for a split second the room almost obeyed before it remembered the social structure it lived under. Dr. Adrian Cole turned toward her with the faintly amused expression of a man preparing to humiliate someone in public. He reminded her, in that polished tone he used when he wanted to sound gracious and superior at the same time, that the trauma room was not a classroom. He meant to put her back in place. He meant to remind the residents and nurses watching that the authority in the room still belonged to him. Then the patient on the center gurney made a strangled, shallow attempt at breathing, and the monitor shifted into a rhythm so wrong that everyone with real training felt it before they consciously registered it. The broad-shouldered man on the bed was soaked in brine, bloodless with shock, and half stripped of identity by a torn tag and a ruined uniform. Lena was already moving before anyone else finished deciding whether the change on the monitor mattered. She reached the bedside, anchored one hand on the rail, scanned the screen, read the patient's chest, and immediately understood what the others had not yet named. In her judgment, the man was not failing from the obvious injury in front of them. He was collapsing from pressure building inside the chest, and it was happening now. Cole began to answer her with irritation, but she did not wait for permission. She ordered surgery paged, called for the massive transfusion protocol to open, demanded space be cleared, and made it clear that if anyone in the room wanted that patient alive and able to walk again, they needed to move. A resident beside Cole hesitated for one fatal second, caught between rank and reality. That was the second when the room began to choose. 38 minutes later, with the floor tacky from saline, the air still thick with heat and adrenaline, and everyone in the department breathing like they had just climbed out of the ocean themselves, that same patient would open his eyes, look past the surgeons, administrators, and fluorescent glare, and lock onto Lena with the exhausted certainty of someone finding a figure from another life. He would whisper a single word that would make a decorated SEAL Master Chief go pale where he stood. The word would be Kestrel. Before the sirens and that whisper and the silence that fell afterward like judgment, Lena Vale had been known around Tidewater Memorial by a simpler title. She was the quiet nurse on evenings. That was the label people used when they did not know she could hear them, and when they did not care enough to imagine she might have an interior life more complicated than the one they had assigned her. She was described as competent enough, perhaps a little too soft for trauma, maybe someone more suited to a step-down unit than real emergency chaos. People said she was good with charts and organization, but not exactly built for the speed and abrasion of the trauma bay. None of them called her stupid. The people in institutions like Tidewater were usually too practiced to be that crude. Instead, they said smaller things that did the same work. They gave her the low-status tasks when the room got crowded. They explained obvious things in front of interns. They praised louder nurses for instincts Lena had quietly voiced minutes earlier. They kept her in a category that made them comfortable. Tidewater Memorial sat near the water on the edge of Norhaven, a fictional harbor city in Virginia where salt seemed to hang in the air even inside the ambulance bay. It was the kind of place where shipyard workers, tourists, military families, and federal transfers all passed through the same emergency department, and where every third family seemed to know someone in uniform. That gave the hospital a particular atmosphere. It also gave the doctors who worked there an audience. Dr. Adrian Cole understood audiences instinctively. He was quick with decisions, elegant with language, handsome in the polished way institutions reward, and gifted at making other people's competence feel as if it naturally belonged to him. Executives loved him. Donors recognized him. Residents copied his posture and tone. From a distance, his confidence looked like leadership. Up close, the illusion thinned. If a nurse challenged him in front of others, he laughed first, corrected second, and punished later. If a resident looked too bright, too independent, or too capable, that resident soon found themselves buried under impossible schedules disguised as educational opportunities. If someone quiet turned out to be excellent, Cole had a special talent for making that excellence feel like disobedience. Lena had been in his department for just under 5 months. She was 32, slight, composed, and almost unnervingly still when everyone around her moved too fast. She wore her dark hair in a plain knot and clipped her badge in exactly the same place every shift. She never lingered in gossip circles and never volunteered personal stories in the break room. She did not flatter physicians who liked being flattered, and she seemed untouched by the tribal need to be seen performing confidence. She also did certain things that did not fit the picture people had built of her. She always stood where she could see both the patient and the door. She read a room the way some people read weather. She could listen to a bank of monitors from across the room and identify which alarm mattered without even looking up. Once, in a rare quiet stretch at 3 in the morning, a supply cart wheel jammed and a frustrated resident cursed under his breath. Lena crouched, cleared the axle, rebuilt the locking pin in under 20 seconds, and stood back up with the practiced economy of someone who had done that sort of thing many times before. When someone asked where she had learned that, she only answered that it had been a different job. That answer should have been enough. In hospitals, people came from every kind of prior life, but there were other small slips. Under pressure, she used language that did not belong to civilian nursing culture. She referred to a bottleneck in the hallway as a choke point. She described a cluster of incoming patients as a stack. During a hypothermia case brought in from the bay, she asked for warmed saline and a thermal wrap before the attending had fully reached the bedside, and a paramedic answered her with the reflexive response one might give to a physician or officer. The room had gone still for half a second then, but Lena had not corrected him. She had only kept her attention on the patient. The first person in Tidewater who seemed to recognize that there was more to Lena than silence was not a doctor at all. It was Miriam Soto, the night shift unit clerk, who noticed everything because nobody important ever remembered to lower their voices around clerks. Miriam saw that Lena always arrived early but never made a show of it. She noticed that Lena's lunches were neatly wrapped, simple, and often untouched until the end of a shift. She noticed the old watch Lena wore on a black band, not flashy, just durable, its scratched bezel hinting at years that had hit harder than hospital walls. One evening, a man in civilian clothes came in asking for directions to outpatient rehab. He spotted Lena across the lobby and straightened instinctively, the way people do when they suddenly think they are in the presence of someone who once outranked them. He recovered quickly and apologized, saying he must have mistaken her for someone else. Lena smiled once and said that he probably had not. Miriam told nobody about that exchange. Not because she was noble, but because she enjoyed being the only person holding one of the puzzle pieces. Cole, meanwhile, had built his own story about Lena. He decided her quiet competence existed only because she stayed silent long enough for louder people to make mistakes around her. He interpreted her restraint as insecurity. He told himself that teasing her in front of residents was helping her adapt to trauma culture. One evening, while reviewing scans with interns and a surgery resident, he told her she could stop hovering like a substitute teacher and reminded her that in his department people moved fast. She had only been standing there because he had asked a question about the patient's pressure 3 minutes earlier, and nobody around him knew the answer. She gave him the exact trend, informed him the lactate had come back high, and set the chart down with the correct page facing him before leaving to help a frightened woman whose husband still had not been seen. That was how it always happened. The humiliation never rose to the level of formal complaint. It came disguised as humor, culture, and efficient leadership. It was death by paper cuts, delivered by someone with credentials and a reputation polished enough to make the cuts look educational. On the first Thursday in October, the air pressure dropped before the storm reached the coast. You could feel it in the ambulance bay doors and hear it in the wind leaning against the building. Harbor lights blurred on the wet glass, and the emergency department entered that pre-storm state hospitals learn over years, quiet enough to prepare and busy enough to forget that everyone is bracing. Lena had the trauma board that evening. Cole had a donor dinner later and was irritated that real work might complicate his image management. By 6:30, he had already corrected a resident for speaking too softly, dismissed a nurse practitioner's concern in front of family members, and informed Lena that if she wanted to stay in emergency medicine, she would need more visible confidence. She had been hanging the second unit of blood on a crash admission when he said it. Without looking up, she replied that visible and useful were not always the same thing. One resident nearly choked trying not to react. Cole stepped closer and lowered his voice, which somehow made the exchange feel more public. He told her that tonight she would observe trauma decisions and not drive them. Lena met his eyes and said she understood. To him, that meant obedience. To her, it meant only that she had heard him. At 7:12 p.m., dispatch called in the first alert. There had been a multi-casualty marine training accident near the inlet, possibly involving vessel impact. Several injured were coming in, 2 critical, and 1 high-priority transfer would arrive under military escort. Saltwater exposure, blunt trauma, and possible inhalation injury were all in the report. The department sharpened instantly. Phones lifted. Whiteboards filled. Respiratory was paged. Blood bank was alerted. Security cleared the receiving corridor. Cole rolled his shoulders and smiled like an actor stepping onto a stage, making some comment about showing the night shift how grown-ups handled real work. Lena was already checking warmers, airway carts, backup suction, and the second ultrasound. A nervous intern asked what kind of marine training had gone wrong. Cole dismissed the distinction, insisting trauma was trauma. Lena glanced at the partially garbled dispatch update and saw one line manually re-entered after a signal drop. The incoming transfer was from Meridian Point Annex, a naval installation that was neither large nor public. Her hand paused on the chart rack. Then she kept working. The first patient came in shivering so hard the bed rails shook. He was young, conscious, and full of seawater, with bruised ribs and confused eyes. A corpsman ran beside him with a report so concise it sounded memorized under stress. The second patient arrived seconds later with a fractured arm, facial lacerations, and eyes too clear for the amount of pain he should have been in. He kept asking for his commanding officer. Then Bay 3 came alive. The third gurney rolled in under military escort, flanked by 2 drenched men whose bearing identified them even before the clipped cadence of their speech did. The patient on the bed was broad-shouldered, heavily built, gray around the mouth and breathing weakly behind an oxygen mask. Bruising showed on the right side beneath his torn uniform top. His pulse raced while his blood pressure slipped. The chart suggested probable chest trauma from impact, but the pattern was wrong. Cole approached the bedside with calm that was just performative enough to be visible. One of the escorts, an older master chief furious with fear and holding it together with discipline, told him to keep the man alive. Cole answered with that smooth smile of his and a line that sounded clever in a calmer room. Lena's eyes were on the patient's neck, chest rise, bruising pattern, and monitor. She needed only seconds. She said he was tightening. Cole did not look up. He insisted the patient was hypotensive from blunt trauma. Lena repeated herself more firmly now, pointing out that the collapse was outpacing the visible loss. Cole waved her back. The resident beside him began listing injuries. Respiratory adjusted oxygen. Another nurse started fluids. One of the escorts clutched the rail so hard his knuckles went white. The commander's hand shifted weakly against the sheet, more reflex than intention. Lena leaned close and told him to stay with the sound of her voice. His lashes moved just enough to show that someone was still fighting inside the failing body. Then Bay 4 called for assistance. Bay 1 alarmed. The lights flickered as the storm struck the building in earnest and the whole department inhaled. Cole split his attention for half a sentence. Still issuing broad orders, still assuming the room would organize itself around his authority because it usually did. The resident misread that turn of attention as permission to stay the current course. The military escort took the attending's confidence for competence, and time continued moving without concern for status. Lena watched the patient's trachea, the chest excursion, the trend line, the color around the mouth. She called for massive transfusion, demanded surgery be physically present rather than reached by phone, instructed respiratory to prepare for rapid deterioration, and effectively announced that another bay could wait 12 seconds. Cole snapped at her that he had already said not now. Lena met him with a level look and said that if they waited, the patient would crash. For one taut second, hierarchy and evidence stood face to face. Then the blood pressure fell again, and the monitor made the kind of sound that medicine hears first in the spine and only later in the ears. That was the moment the room changed. Cole moved back toward the patient, but some of his shine had gone dull. The resident was pale. An escort demanded action. Lena already had her hand on the backup kit and told the doctor that the man was compensating past the edge. Pressure needed to be relieved now. Cole looked at the chest, the numbers, and then at Lena, angry that the data had chosen her timing instead of his. Finally, he ordered preparation. It was not an apology or even an admission. It was permission wrapped in wounded pride. The next 30 seconds belonged more to Lena than to anyone else, not because she outranked anyone, but because once a room passes a certain threshold, people begin following the steadiest voice without realizing they are doing it. She ordered the left side cleared, corrected monitor placement, told staff to keep the patient talking if he woke, and snapped at the slowness of blood delivery until someone fixed it. She never raised her volume. She lowered everyone else's panic. When the intervention came, it came fast and clean, with the attending physically present and the resident assisting. Yet the cadence in the room was Lena's. Later, multiple people would say it felt as though she had run that exact disaster 100 times before. The patient's chest eased. His next breath actually completed. The pressure rose by a number so small it looked meaningless to the untrained eye and so significant that everyone in the room leaned in at once. Cole's jaw tightened. He told the team to continue as if it had all unfolded under his command. Lena did not waste time resenting the theft. She was already scanning for the next threat, calling for imaging only after a repeat assessment, warning that the patient was not stable enough to travel unless the trend held, and ordering ICU clearance upstairs. One of the escorts stared at her with that unsettled half-recognition people get when memory is approaching but has not fully arrived. Then the rest of the department began to break apart under the weight of simultaneous crisis. A younger service member in another bay started coughing pink foam. A civilian patient coded. Power dipped hard enough for the generator to kick in with a deep mechanical thump through the walls. The intercom died for 4 full seconds. A transport team got trapped behind redirected security traffic. Central supply disappeared into a systems reset. Cole tried to cover everything at once, which meant he briefly controlled none of it. Lena did the opposite. She reduced the entire department to priorities. Bay 3 was red. Bay 2 remained yellow unless he dropped. Bay 1 had its own code team and needed no interference. The corridor had to be opened. Respiratory needed 1 person with her and 1 floating. Miriam was told to reroute non-critical incoming patients to fast track immediately. Miriam obeyed without blinking. Residents followed Lena's instructions before they realized they were following a nurse. Cole opened his mouth, perhaps to reclaim command, perhaps to accuse her again, but Bay 3's patient was destabilizing for a second time, and Lena was already back at his side, checking lines, dressings, abdomen, and response. She leaned close and asked if he could hear her. His eyes opened a fraction, ruined by pain and salt, but they turned toward her voice. She told him to stay anchored. One of the escorts whispered for him to stay with them. The commander's gaze slid over Lena's face and stopped for 1 impossible second, as if some deeper part of him recognized the presence before conscious memory could reach it. Then his eyes closed again. A younger resident, hands trembling, asked Lena how she was reading all of it so fast. She answered only that the room was speaking and told him to listen. It sounded like nonsense until it didn't. The wrong alarm, the slowing response to blood, the way the patient's fingers no longer curled when touched, the sickening stillness of a body about to surrender. Lena caught another early drop before the monitor fully displayed it. She repositioned, corrected, checked, and flagged the possibility of a second concealed injury before imaging confirmed it. She did it without performance, without theatrics, with the relentless clarity of someone who understood that medicine was often not about brilliance, but about hearing what everyone else was too loud to hear. By the time surgery arrived physically in the room, there was nothing left to debate. The patient would likely have died if Lena had not forced the room to move when she did. Nobody said it aloud yet, but several people would later write exactly that in carefully chosen language meant to survive administrative review. For 39 brutal minutes, Tidewater Memorial belonged to Lena's rhythm. The storm intensified, ambulance reports stacked, the generator stabilized. Hallways filled with damp uniforms and tightly controlled faces from Meridian Point. Through all of it, Lena moved like someone who had once learned that confusion kills faster than blood loss. She reassigned a flustered but useful resident to a lower-stakes patient and put a steadier nurse where calm mattered most. She caught a medication delay before it hit a bedside. She redirected security to clear a family corridor so a transfer could move without collision. She separated 1 coughing patient from the rest before aspiration complicated the whole trauma pattern. Twice Cole contradicted her. Twice, the evidence corrected him within minutes. First, he insisted Bay 2's decline was anxiety and pain. Lena saw the trend and the skin tone and said the patient was tiring, respiratory needed to return. She was right. Then he wanted the commander moved to imaging before it was safe simply because the scanner was open. Lena stepped directly into his path and said that if the patient left now, he might not arrive with a pulse. There were 6 witnesses to that sentence. Cole's face shifted through disbelief, insult, and finally awareness, because by then the room had begun orienting toward Lena when the next critical decision approached. Her calls were landing. His authority was slipping. For Adrian Cole, those were not separate problems. Eventually, the commander stabilized enough for transfer upstairs. He was not safe, not comfortable, and not out of danger, but he was alive. As the transport team moved him, one of the escorts, a master chief with sea-gray hair at the temples and eyes trained by long service not to miss much, paused beside Lena. He looked at her longer than strangers typically do and said that she had done that kind of thing before. Lena answered that everyone in the hospital had. He said not like that. She only told him he should go with his officer. He nodded and called her ma'am in a way that felt too instinctive and too old to be accidental. Cole heard it. Lena heard it. Neither acknowledged it. As the department settled in fragments, the institution began its predictable second act. The civilian code resolved. The coughing service member stabilized. Rain hammered the glass. People who had just survived an hour of relying on Lena began the process of pretending they had not been carried through it by the woman they had treated as ornamental. Institutions protect themselves this way. They do not always deny reality. Sometimes they just rush to rename it. Cole was first. Standing near the trauma station with damp cuffs and a reconstructed expression of control, he began recounting the commander's case to administration before the bay had even been cleaned. He described it as complicated blunt chest trauma in an unusually chaotic environment and admitted there had been some confusion in task routing before structure was restored. He referred to Lena as one of the nurses who had become overinvolved in command language under stress and suggested her behavior had created noise. Lena heard that while carrying used supplies to decontamination. She kept walking until she realized he intended to let that version stand unchallenged. Then she turned and said that noise was when people talked over the patient, and what happened in there had kept him alive. The hallway fell silent enough for the rain outside to sound louder. Cole told her she was tired and forgetting where she was. Lena answered that she knew exactly where she was. For a brief moment it seemed possible that truth might survive in the hallway. Then the associate director, terrified of conflict and trained by career preservation, sided upward. She suggested everyone breathe and debrief after documentation. Cole agreed with false graciousness, and then in front of half the staff, instructed Lena to return to tasks appropriate to her role. That was the first public punishment. By 9:19, the first rumor had already formed. Not about the commander or the storm, but about Lena. She had overstepped. She had barked at physicians. She had confused military escorts. She had tried to run the room. No one person created the lie in full. That was what made it effective. A resident embarrassed by how much he had depended on her called her intense. A supervisor repeated Cole's phrase about command language. A charge nurse who disliked disorder said Lena had made things hard to track. What none of them said was that every critical patient from the incident was alive, or that at least one almost certainly would not have been without her. Lena sat at the charting station and wrote exactly what had happened. Times, changes, requested orders, delayed orders, patient responses. She documented like someone who knew a fight was coming and understood that the chart might become the only witness that would not blink. Miriam slid a cup of bitter coffee toward her without comment. Lena thanked her. Miriam warned that Cole was angry and not in the ordinary way. Lena said she knew. At 9:42, the nursing supervisor approached, wearing the carefully neutral face that usually meant trouble. Cole wanted a debrief in Conference B immediately. Miriam muttered a soft curse. Lena saved her note, stood, and smoothed the front of her scrub top as if straightening cloth could make the next 10 minutes less insulting. Conference B smelled like old carpet and dry erase markers. Cole was already seated at the long table with the associate director, a shift supervisor, and an HR liaison who had clearly been pulled in against her will and wanted nothing to do with the situation. The door clicked shut behind Lena. Cole announced that they would keep things efficient, which was how polished people often introduced private damage. He began with the thinnest possible compliment, acknowledging Lena's initiative before accusing her of repeatedly exceeding nursing scope in both language and operational posture. thereby creating confusion and potentially compromising chain of command in a multi-casualty event. The HR liaison looked down instantly. Lena remained standing and asked which patient outcome had been compromised. Cole replied that patient outcome was not the point. Lena answered that it was exactly the point. The associate director tried to soften the room, saying no one believed Lena had not been trying to help. Cole continued over her, accusing Lena of correcting attending direction in front of staff, reassigning resources without authorization, and introducing non-standard terminology during a critical event. Lena said the terminology had been understood, the resources had been where they were needed, and the attending direction would have sent an unstable patient to imaging prematurely. The supervisor visibly winced. Cole smiled with no warmth and told her that this was the issue, that she did not get to decide such things. Lena answered that the patient had lived. Cole leaned back and said only that the patient had lived for now. That kind of sentence was professional cruelty at its purest. Lena chose precision over protest. She said her note reflected her timeline and suggested it be compared to telemetry, badge access, and trauma bay footage. For the first time that night, Cole's eyes sharpened with something close to caution. He recovered by insisting the meeting was a behavioral debrief, not a trial. Lena said they had called her in because she had prevented a bad call in front of witnesses. Cole hit the table lightly, just hard enough to seize the air. He reminded her that she was a nurse in his trauma department and would not speak as if she outranked her attending. Possession, not policy, sat inside that sentence. The shift supervisor tried weakly to suggest concerns be documented and revisited later. Cole used the opening to announce that effective immediately, Nurse Vale was removed from lead trauma duty pending review. It was not termination, but it was public enough to stain. The associate director said nothing. The HR liaison typed. Lena let the silence grow long enough for the shape of the injustice to stand fully in the room. Then she asked whether the action was being taken because she had been wrong. Cole answered that it was because she had been inappropriate. Lena nodded once and told him to put every concern in writing, with exact times, exact actions, exact patient impacts, and his signature. In that moment, for the first time all evening, Adrian Cole no longer looked like the smartest person in the room. At 10:03 p.m. they escorted her out of lead duty, not with security and not with theatrical cruelty. Institutions usually prefer punishment that can still be described as process. The shift supervisor walked beside her through the corridor, speaking in low tones about optics and misunderstandings, and how review could come later. The entire performance was designed to look humane while ensuring everyone on the floor saw that Lena Vale had been handled. She passed the trauma station. Conversations softened. A resident who had followed her instructions through the worst of the emergency suddenly became fascinated with his shoes. Miriam looked angry enough to set the hospital on fire with a stapler. Cole remained by the board speaking to surgery as if nothing of consequence had happened. Lena did not stop. At her locker, she put away the spare penlight, folded the undershirt she kept for double shifts, and tightened the old watch band after washing her wrists. The supervisor tried to reassure her that the action might not stick. Lena answered that it already had. When the supervisor explained that Cole was under pressure and needed to show control, Lena said that he should have shown it in the trauma bay. The supervisor had no answer. As Lena lifted her bag, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It said the report had been received, instructed her to stay available, and told her not to leave campus yet. There was no signature. She read it once, locked the screen, and slipped the phone away. Outside, thunder rolled over the harbor. Somewhere upstairs, the commander she had fought to keep alive was either sleeping, worsening, or waking into pain. Down here, the institution that had benefited from her competence had chosen to punish her for making it visible. She did not leave. Instead, she went to a vending alcove near the old family waiting room where the lights were warmer, and the floor cleaner, and people only arrived at night if they were exhausted or hurting. She bought a bottle of water she did not want and sat beneath a muted television, showing weather maps no one was truly watching. For the first time in hours, she let herself feel the insult rather than the emergency. She thought about how Cole had used the language of professionalism to punish effectiveness, how the room had looked down when he did it, and how a patient's life could depend on whether the right person was willing to sound impolite. Across from her, a child's abandoned puzzle lay half-finished on a low table. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed too loudly at something not funny. Hospitals were always like that, catastrophe and triviality sharing walls. Her phone buzzed again. This time there was a name. Captain Elise Warren needed 5 minutes in a private family consult room near the ICU elevators. Lena stood and went. The elevators to ICU were brighter and colder than the rest of the building, as if the hospital wanted everyone approaching them to remember that truly important things happened upstairs. Two uniformed men stood near the secured doors. One stepped aside immediately. The other looked at her badge, then at her face, and straightened in a way that suggested he had been told more than her job title. Captain Warren waited in the room with the lights low and the blinds half drawn. She was in Navy service khakis under a rain-darkened coat, late 40s, posture immaculate, and possessed of a quiet authority that did not need theater. She began to call Lena by a rank, stopped herself almost imperceptibly, and switched to Nurse Vale. Warren noted that Lena had been removed from trauma duty and asked on what stated basis. Lena answered with behavioral overreach. Warren's expression sharpened almost invisibly. She explained that a very senior patient was alive, that several of her people had inconsistent descriptions of how that had happened, and that a man downstairs was speaking with a confidence that might exceed his understanding. Commander Nathan Briggs, she said, had asked a question before sedation resumed. He had wanted to know who the woman in trauma was. Lena looked away first. Warren observed that she was not asking for secrets yet, only whether Cole's version deserved the confidence administration was placing in it. Lena said it deserved review. Warren replied that it was about to get one. At 11:28 p.m., while the storm battered the harbor, Captain Elise Warren entered the emergency department with Tidewater's chief nursing officer, the hospital's night administrator, and a senior risk officer dragged in from home. Cole, expecting praise from military brass, straightened and stepped forward with the practiced warmth of a public-facing physician. Warren shook his hand politely and immediately asked who had activated split-priority routing when communications lagged. Cole blinked. He answered broadly about his team adjusting dynamically in accordance with protocol. Warren repeated the question. Then she asked who had flagged decompression urgency before the initial decline. Cole tried to redirect the conversation toward patient outcome rather than individual phrasing in a chaotic room. Warren answered that patient outcome was exactly why she was parsing it. The chief nursing officer suggested they pull logs, badge movement, and note timing. Warren agreed and told them to do it. Cole laughed lightly and suggested the review wait for daylight. Warren said no. That was another moment when the room changed. The review did not happen in one dramatic confrontation. It happened in layers. Miriam printed call histories and overhead outage timestamps at the central desk. In an office down the hall, the risk officer requested badge access records for the trauma corridor. Imaging confirmed the exact time Bay 3 would have moved had the earlier order been followed. ICU documented the commander's status and relayed that he had briefly awakened, agitated, before settling again. Throughout the department, the social order that had seemed so stable only hours earlier began to wobble under the force of simple questions asked by people who expected real answers. Cole hated questions he had not curated. He shadowed the review, smoothing, reframing, widening the story into generic chaos whenever possible. Warren kept narrowing it again. Who gave that order? Who corrected that trend? Who prevented transport? Who said the patient was tightening? Not what broadly happened, but who actually saw it first. She did not summon Lena immediately. That unsettled Cole more than anything else. Authority that already knows enough rarely begins by interrogating the weakest person in the room. Instead, Warren spoke to the people around Lena. The respiratory therapist admitted, after a long breath, that Lena had identified the commander's decline before the monitor fully alarmed. A resident quietly confirmed imaging had been requested too early. The corpsman escort said, in careful, neutral language, that the female nurse had been the first person who sounded as if she understood the whole picture. Finally, Miriam contributed no medical opinions at all, only precise timeline and observable fact. She said Cole had told Lena not to drive trauma decisions, then used her calls until the patient stabilized, and afterward had called it noise. The night administrator wrote that down. At 12:14 a.m., Lena was called back to conference B. This time the room looked different. There were more people and much less certainty. Cole sat at one end with his arms folded. Warren stood near the window with rain streaking the glass behind her. The chief nursing officer, risk officer, night administrator, and a quiet legal representative were all present. Lena entered with her badge straight and shoulders level. No one offered her a seat until Warren did. That small gesture altered the balance of the room more than any speech could have. The risk officer asked for Lena's account of the trauma response, especially regarding Commander Briggs. She gave it cleanly, without exaggeration and without defensiveness. She walked them through dispatch, presentation, decline, the mismatch between visible injury and collapse, the warning she issued, the delay, the intervention, the second instability, the attempted early transfer, and the need to prioritize actual physiology over idealized hierarchy. When she finished, silence followed. Then Cole leaned forward and insisted that no matter how eloquent her reconstruction, it remained unacceptable to normalize a nurse assuming command language over an attending physician during active trauma. Warren turned to him and asked whether Lena's assessment had proved materially correct. Cole attempted to evade, saying that was not the sole issue. Warren repeated the question. Eventually, he admitted that in one aspect it had. The risk officer asked about transport timing. Cole claimed it could have gone either way. The imaging statement on the table said otherwise, indicating the patient likely would have arrested in transit. Warren tapped the paper and let it speak for itself. Cole tried one final line about emergency medicine not being a courtroom. Warren answered that in courtrooms people were less likely to die from ego. Then Warren asked Lena where she had trained. Lena gave the civilian answer first: nursing school in Richmond, critical care certification, trauma cross-training after transfer. Warren nodded and asked about before that. Cole gave a short laugh as if biography were irrelevant. Warren ignored him. Lena's fingers rested still on the chair arm. She said that before nursing school she had been enlisted. Warren asked in what capacity. Lena answered that she had been medical. Warren kept going. Lena said she had served as a corpsman, then in advanced tactical casualty support, then in critical care transport. The chief nursing officer blinked. The risk officer lifted his pen. Cole smiled with contemptuous relief, as if he had found a version of the story he preferred. He said prior military medic work was admirable but did not grant authority in a civilian trauma bay. Lena agreed that it did not. Warren asked whether there was anything else they should know. Lena replied that not unless it became relevant. Cole called that convenient. Warren informed him that she determined relevance. Before the conversation could continue, an ICU resident appeared in the doorway and said Commander Briggs was awake again and asking for the trauma nurse. Cole immediately tried to dismiss the request as the meaningless agitation of a sedated patient. Warren asked which trauma nurse. The resident said he had not given a name, only asked for the quiet one. Every head in the room turned toward Lena. ICU at night carried none of the emergency department's noise. There were only machines, breath, distant footsteps, and the eerie calm of measured fights for life. Lena walked behind Warren toward the commander's room. Cole, the chief nursing officer, and the risk officer followed close enough to witness and far enough to pretend this remained routine. Two uniformed operators stood outside the room. One straightened at the sight of Lena with an instinct he could not quite hide. The other frowned as memory stirred and stepped aside. Inside, Commander Nathan Briggs looked smaller than legends are meant to look, reduced by injury, dressings, monitoring leads, and the honesty of pain. His eyes were open and searching. Warren stepped to the bedside. Then Lena moved into view. Something changed immediately in his face. It was not simple recognition, but the body's deeper memory of safety. He stared at her with the exhausted certainty of a man surfacing into the presence of someone his survival instincts already knew. Lena addressed him by rank. His throat worked. The sound that came out was barely there, but the word reached the room with the force of a dropped blade. He called her Kestrel. The reaction around the bed made clear that the word meant everything. Master Chief Noah Grant, who had entered behind them without fanfare, went still as carved stone. One of the operators outside made a sound halfway between breath and curse. Warren's posture sharpened. Cole looked openly confused. Briggs kept staring at Lena and tried to lift a hand, failing. Lena steadied the blanket near his wrist and told him it was all right. His eyes closed briefly, calmer because the voice was there. Grant stepped forward slowly, staring at Lena as if the impossible had just become administrative fact. Warren asked Briggs to confirm whether Nurse Lena Vale was Kestrel. He lacked the strength for speech, but he managed the faintest nod. That was enough. For Adrian Cole, the revelation unfolded in stages. First came irritation, because exclusive language in front of authority always feels like exclusion to people who live on control. Then confusion, because everyone else in the room had reacted as though a hidden door had opened and he alone could not see what lay behind it. Then came the first edge of danger. Grant said softly that he had known he recognized the voice. Cole demanded an explanation. Warren let the recognition stand before offering one. She let the patient's reaction become evidence and allowed Cole to feel, for once, what it meant to be the least informed person in a critical room. Briggs, still looking at Lena, managed to say that he had thought she was dead. Lena answered without drama that she was not. Grant said they had buried her transfer file in rumor for years. Cole demanded to know what exactly was happening. Warren finally turned to him and explained that the nurse he had removed from duty appeared to be the former tactical critical care specialist attached to a classified maritime rescue element whose protocols had shaped casualty pathways many military patients still relied on. Kestrel had been her operational call sign. Commander Briggs had served on a team that credited her with keeping multiple personnel alive during a storm extraction years earlier after comms failure and delayed evacuation. Much of the work had never been public. Grant added that she had been the person people listened for when everything went loud. No medal ceremony followed, no dramatic applause. Reality was crueler and more satisfying than that. The room entered the cold stillness that comes when private history collides with public consequence, and everyone present realizes the paperwork they filed an hour earlier now reads differently. Cole recovered first, though badly. He insisted that prior classified military experience did not exempt anyone from scope or hierarchy in his department. Warren agreed that it did not, but noted that it made dismissing her assessment especially foolish. Cole claimed he had listened. Grant turned toward him slowly and said that if he had truly listened, the commander would have stabilized sooner. It was not loud or emotional, which made it devastating. Cole flushed and began protesting civilian trauma medicine and the impropriety of being lectured in his own hospital. Warren interrupted by asking whether that was coming from the same man whose patient had nearly been transported too early. The chief nursing officer finally found her voice and told Cole that he needed to stop speaking for the moment. But like many powerful people who sensed the floor giving way, he chose ego over judgment. He complained that a secret military backstory did not make Lena infallible, that she had used command tone, reassigned S. TAF, and undermined physician authority in a high-risk environment. Then Lena turned and looked at him fully. When she answered, her calm made everyone else feel noisy. She said that what she had undermined was delay. He opened his mouth again, and she continued by saying that he had wanted a room that looked orderly while she had wanted patients who stayed alive long enough to leave it. That was the line that finally stripped the issue down to truth, not personality, not tone, not wounded prestige. Delay against survival, appearance against outcome. In that room, with a living commander on the bed and the weight of recognition settling over everyone present, the institution could no longer comfortably confuse those things. The quiet nurse had not been overreaching. She had been the most qualified person in the room at the exact moment qualification mattered most. And the people who had underestimated her were left with the far uglier task of deciding whether they would admit it.